Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jim Seveny, and I'm just going to quickly lead you through the Pledge of Allegiance, say a couple of words of introduction to our town historian, who will carry the ball from there with the story behind the Portsmouth Compact. So if you'll please all take your feet, and please keep your feet for a moment of silence for our men and women in the armed service. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thanks everybody. This is now our second or third year in a row doing this, so it's becoming an annual thing to with the grace of the state, they bring down the original compact so we can all have a look and just revisit our roots. I would like to introduce Jim Garman. Jim was a longtime history and photography instructor, teacher at the Portsmouth Abbey, something approaching 100 years, so he tells me. Several years ago, the town saw fit, wisely, to anoint him as our official town historian. He also holds the chairmanship for the Portsmouth Historical Society, which you may or may not have noticed, but over the past couple of years has really breathed new life into itself, much to him and some of the new members that came aboard. But that place is becoming a real beehive of activity, and if you haven't been up there, you ought to go. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Senator Seveny. Really appreciate people showing up today for this. It's really an exciting day for us because of the great opportunity to see this piece of paper up here that is 138 years older than the Declaration of Independence. Think about that. Amazing. So I'm here as a representative of the Portsmouth Historical Society, as Senator Seveny mentioned. I've been the president for about a year and a half now, and we have really increased our membership, but we're still looking for more. We've had a dramatic increase from 88 members to 488 members, and we really would like to have every one of you sign up. This is Founders Day. We decided to ask the town council to proclaim the 7th of March every year as Founders Day. The reason for that is that we needed a date to celebrate the compact. I have to advise you that although the compact was written on March 7th, March 7th wasn't necessarily March 7th. The people who came here established, in effect, a new calendar, and things got really kind of turned around a little bit. In any case, it says on the compact, the seventh day of the first month, and so that's what we decided to just settle that by saying March 7th. So with the support of the town council last year and with the great interest generated by them and also the Historical Society, we have made Founders Day an annual celebration. So what I'm here to talk about a little bit today is about the compact itself. The compact is a very important document. A lot of people for many years saw the signs around town that said founded on the compact, and they had no idea what that meant. And so I'm going to tell you about that today. It's a long story to get into, and I'm not going to, so you can rest easy. But the first settlers who came to Portsmouth, some of them, especially Anne Hutchinson, were banished from Massachusetts, from Boston. The Boston settlement was what we call a theocracy, in which the ministers were not only the religious leaders, but also the political leaders. And they exercised a very rigid control over the population. Well, Anne Hutchinson was a very outspoken woman, as you may have heard, and she challenged the church. I won't go into all the details of how she challenged. She disagreed with some of the things the ministers were saying. She gathered a group of people around her at her home to talk about the minister's sermon yesterday, and things like that. And it really got fairly critical. And so she was sort of separated out. We have to keep in mind she was a woman after all, and women had very little political rights at that time. And so she was separated out and brought to trial. Brought to two trials. She actually had a civil trial and she had a religious trial. And the crime that she was charged with in the civil trial was, in the words of the day, traducing the ministers, unquote. In other words, she was criticizing the ministers, and you couldn't do that. So she was banished, and also she was accused in a religious trial of lying to the leaders of the church. And so she had two trials. The end result was that she was banished from Boston in the fall of 1637. And she was allowed to stay over the winter. They made her stay away from her home. She had 17 children, by the way, altogether, not all at one time. I mean, not living with her all at one time. But anyway, she was banished and had to leave. Well, where should we go? We don't care. Just get out of here. That's what they told her. Now, the circle of friends of hers, and there were a couple others that also were banished, only a couple. But she gathered a group of people together that were friends of hers who decided, well, we'll go too. And the most important of those people was a man by the name of William Coddington. William Coddington was the wealthiest man in Boston. This is signified by the fact that he had a brick house, which is very unusual. And he was a merchant, and a successful merchant. Now, sometimes you hear stories about the people who came to Portsmouth from Boston were a bunch of sort of ne'er-do-wells. They were some of the wealthiest people in Boston. They were merchants, they were people involved in trade, and a lot of them were really well off, including Anne Hutchinson's husband, Will Hutchinson. Okay, so after her trial, they knew that some of them were going to leave. They also, by the way, were disarmed. They were forced to turn in their weapons that they had. And the group met at the home, we think, we don't have a lot of verification of this, the home of William Coddington. And they decided that they better put together a decision of what we're going to do, where we're going to go. So what they created was what Montesquieu in the French Enlightenment had called a social contract. This was an agreement, a document agreeing to sort of band together. Otherwise, they were going to go out in the wilderness someplace. And who knew who was going to take care of whom? So they really were at a loss and felt they had to get some kind of banding together. And so on the 7th of March, as best we can tell, in 1638, they created the Portsmouth Compact. And the Portsmouth Compact says the following, and I'm going to read it to you. It's very short. We whose names are underwritten do here solemnly in the presence of Jehovah incorporate ourselves into a body politique as he shall help will submit our persons, lives, estates unto our Lord Jesus Christ, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, and to all those perfect and most absolute laws of his, given us in his holy word of truth to be guided and judged thereby. In other words, what they're doing is they're banding together to be judged by God's law. It's interesting that there is no mention of the British monarch in this statement. The British monarch was King Charles I at this time. So what they were doing in some ways, and it's a reach, they were sort of declaring their independence from colonial America. They were going off on their own. Now, meanwhile, they were negotiating with Roger Williams, who had settled Providence in 1636. He had been banished from Massachusetts also. And he assisted them in negotiations. They had plans to go to various places. They were thinking about Delaware, what became Delaware. They were thinking about Long Island. They were thinking about New Jersey. But Williams convinced them that there was a possibility that they could purchase Aquidneck Island from the Indians. And so Roger Williams assisted them in negotiations with the Indians. and they decided to buy Aquidneck Island. The Indians, the Narragansetts that were here, were all over this area. The headquarters of the Narragansetts was over in what we today call Narragansett, over in that area, Narragansett Country, South County. But the sachems, or chiefs, that were in this area were two Native Americans named Canonicus and Miantinomi. Those are familiar names, perhaps, that you know from some of the geographical things that were named after them around here. So Williams helped them purchase the island. Now, back to the compact a little bit. The signatures on the compact. We don't see Anne Hutchinson there, do we? Okay. Why not? She was a woman. She didn't have the right to speak. We do see her husband. We see her her brother-in-law. We see her two children, in-laws. And so a lot of her family was involved in the signing of the compact. When you look at a compact, when you look at a document from the 17th century and a number of people sign it, what really happened generally was that the most important person signed it first. William Coddington signed the compact first. Okay? Now, also signing second, and we think, again, there's no absolute research on this, we think that the document was written by the Reverend Dr. John Clark. And he was a minister. He also was a physician. Now, there are 4 quotations, biblical quotations on the compact. You can see that when you look close. Just the citations of them. Exodus 24, 3, 4, and so on. We think that John Clark probably wrote the compact as a result of the discussion of other people. The third person to sign the compact was Will Hutchinson, Anne Hutchinson's husband. So those signatures are on there. And that's what's really incredible about seeing the original. These people sat down in 1638 and signed this piece of paper, and you can still see their signatures and read them. To me, as a historian, that's just awesome. I mean, so much of in the modern day with modern culture and emails and everything else, we see copies of things, copies of things. But here's the original. And that's what's really special about this, because you can see them and envision the fact that they sat down at this point and signed this document. That's really pretty amazing. So, Anne's 2 son-in-laws, John Sanford and Thomas Savage, signed the compact. Anne's son, Edward, signed. Will's brother, Edward Sr., also signed it. So the signatures on the compact, I should mention also, there are 4 signatures at the bottom of the compact. And somebody said there's a scratch over those names. It isn't a scratch. They were scratched out. Now, the issue there is, did they come with the first settlers? 3 of the 4 of them eventually did come, but probably not in the spring of 1638. So that's probably why they were scratched out. They signed the compact along with everybody else, and then their names were crossed out. Those names were, and oops, turn the page. Thomas Clark, John Johnson, William Hall, and John Brightman. We don't have much of a legacy of those names in Portsmouth. But the other names, we have a ton. Do we have any descendants here from any of these signers? Just curious, last time we had one. But names like Freeborn, Cogshall, Wilbur, Sherman, and so on were all, people who stayed in Portsmouth for 370 some years, some of them. So it's really pretty amazing to see those names. Now, back to the purchase. They purchased the island, the whole Aquidneck Island, from the Indians for a price of 40 fathoms of white beads. Now, that's almost like $24 for Manhattan. In any case, the further agreement, though, in this negotiation, and the charter exists, the deed exists, they agreed to evacuate the island, the Indians, in exchange for 10 rakes and 20 hoes, garden hoes. Okay? So that was the negotiations that went on. They signed this agreement over in the Narragansett area, and this is all done in March, I think it was March 24th of 1638. So, they began to come. Anne got here in April. She walked from Boston with her children to Providence in the winter time. Then from Providence, she took a ship and came down. And they came in two different places into Portsmouth. One was the town pond, which, if you're not familiar with where that is, it's behind the Roger Williams Conference Center today. And that was open to the bay. Some of the ships came in there, and some of them came around the other side of the of Island Park and came in that way. So that's how they got here. They set up a settlement in that area. Everybody was given every free man was given a 2-acre house lot. In order to be a free man, you had to be a male, you had to be a taxpayer, and you had to be someone who was eligible to vote in the town meeting. The town meetings were set up right away and was very democratic, except for the infighting that went on in the town meeting. And we still had those when we had town meetings in, 1970s at least, not longer than that. Soon after Anne arrived, there was an earthquake in the area. Big surprise. We have had earthquakes in this area. I can remember one down off Little Compton, about 1965, I think it was. Anyway, John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts Bay, who had been mainly responsible for the banishment of Anne Hutchinson, in his journal made the following statement, that the earthquake was proof of God's disquietude against the existence of Anne Hutchinson, unquote. He didn't like her very much. Now, again, they were escaping Massachusetts Bay, but what you have to keep in mind is that Little Compton, Tiverton, Barrington, Cumberland were all part of Massachusetts at that time. Okay? So the extent of Massachusetts, and that became a serious fear on the part of Anne Hutchinson, was that she hadn't gotten far enough away from Massachusetts. Okay? More about that in a minute. So they established their settlements. They got 2-acre house lots, again in the vicinity of the Roger Williams Conference Center, down that area, around the town pond. And then they began to distribute land. They had several distributions of land. In most cases, the people who among the first settlers, and for the first couple of years, they got as much as 200 acres scattered around the town, going as far as Sandy Point and going as far as Melville. They were really large farms that they had. These people were farmers, but they also, in some cases, were people interested in producing farm produce or producing sheep and horses that they could then send by ship elsewhere. That's important also. So they set up a training ground in the vicinity of Founder's Brook. I hope everybody knows where Founder's Brook is. If you go down Boyd's Lane, you'll see the sign. Excuse me. Founder's Brook is where they had the original training ground, and they would gather there periodically and practice warfare, and they also built a meeting house nearby. The meeting house primarily was the establishment of a man by the name of William Ballston. He was one of the compact signers. You'll see his name there. And William Ballston, in the first year of the colony, was given the right to brew beer, B-E-A-R-E, and sell wine and liquor. We have a new microbrewery that's being created in Portsmouth, and they contacted us and asked if we knew if they were the first brewery in Portsmouth. And we said, we're sorry, but William Ballston beat you. So we've been negotiating back and forth, talking to them, and had a really good relationship with them. And one of the things they're going to do is to have Ballston's Porter as one of their beers. So it's kind of cool. Anyway, So Ballston was an important part of the first settlement too, as you can imagine. Probably about 6 months after he was given this license to brew beer and so on, they decided they needed some stocks because they had some people who were being unruly as a result of Ballston's beer. So they had to put people in stocks in order to discipline them some. I trust you know what stocks are, where you get your hands locked in the wood and so on, okay, and feet. So what happens then as far as the settlement goes is there becomes a certain amount of dissension that goes on among various groups. You have 20 people together and all of a sudden you have 10 over here and 10 over there. The big split, for the most part, was between Anne Hutchinson and William Coddington and their followers. They both, from what we can tell, asserted a lot of control, wanted to assert all the control, and things split. So they had town meetings regularly, and we have minutes of those town meetings that have survived. And over the course of the first year, the town meeting records are very thorough, and they really explain a lot about what was going on. Various land grants were decided. You know, new freemen were accepted. We did, and I think it's important, by the way, if you start talking about democracy in Portsmouth, there were slaves here who obviously had no rights. There also were people who came as servants for people who also had very little in the way of rights. And most important, women didn't have much in the way of political rights. So the idea of and there used to be signs around, because some guy wrote a book in 1915, Portsmouth, Birthplace of American Democracy. That's still on the town website, that maybe we could revise that, shall we say, because it wasn't very democratic. So, meanwhile, and I'll just finish up talking about what happened after. At the town meeting of 28 April 1639, this dispute between the followers of Hutchinson and the followers of Coddington really came to light very publicly. And what happened, this is really bizarre when you think about it, make a good movie. The followers of Coddington, especially William Dyer, who was the clerk and therefore the secretary who kept the meeting, minutes of the meeting, closed the book, walked out. Okay? And they decided they were going to set up a new colony. And so they went way down south to Newport. So Newport was founded by dissenters who descended from the people who were here in Portsmouth. 8 of them went to Newport and established a settlement there. And again, those are all names that you'll become very familiar with if you are familiar with Newport much. Coddington was the leader. Now, there are several reasons. One was the dispute between the two. The second, and in my opinion, it's more of an issue as to why they split, was that Newport provided a much more substantial harbor than Portsmouth did. The settlement in Newport, and interestingly, what we know as Thames Street and America's Cup Avenue, I guess we have to say, almost everything to the right of that was a swamp. And so what they did in the first days of Newport settlement was to bring in Indians to help fill that swamp. And that's why Newport has a serious flood problem. I can remember Hurricane Bob a few years ago. That whole lower Thames area was underwater. Anyway, they built that because they wanted to have the harbor. They wanted to be able to trade. They wanted to have reasonably large ships come in there. And a lot of the trade that was carried out, even sheep and horses, was with the Caribbean. Barbados was a major trading port. And of course, you can imagine, these people were merchants and they survived very well in that new settlement that they had. I mean, it's a whole nother story to get into Newport settlement, but we'll go back to Portsmouth. So what happened was that the people who went to Newport decided they needed a new compact. Again, they're separating further. So they got together and wrote what's considered a second compact. More or less the same kind of thing that we had here in Portsmouth. Now, what that triggered, however, was the people staying in Portsmouth under the leadership, by the way, of William Hutchinson. What they did was to write a third compact. And that differs in a critical way from the first compact, because what that says is that they're going to get together and band together under the, and be ruled by the ideas and ideals of King Charles I. In other words, no more God ruling, making their decisions, it's the king, which is really a significant difference in their charter. Not that it made a whole lot of difference, because they were so far away from Britain, it really, at that time, it didn't really matter that much. So, 1639, Newport is settled. People here decide to continue having a settlement. One of the things that I find interesting about the remaining Portsmouth settlement was, and throughout, probably until the 1670s, there were no churches created in Portsmouth. Okay? They had religious gatherings, but there was no church as such. I think the first major church that was established is what you see out this window over here, the Friends Meeting House, which was in 1700. Okay. That's after the Quaker movement really took off in this area. And in around 1720, 1730, about 3/4 of the people in the colony of Rhode Island were Quakers. It was really, even Coddington became a Quaker. Okay, so Anne Hutchinson decided that she had to leave. She feared Massachusetts. Her husband died in 1642, and she decided to migrate, and she went way out west to the Bronx. Okay. The Bronx was on the periphery of New Netherlands, a Dutch settlement. And the Dutch and the Indians, the Sewanee Indians in particular, didn't get along. So she was out on the frontier, and in 1643, her homestead was attacked, and she was murdered by the Indians, along with several of her children. One of them escaped, was out blueberry picking. The Indians found her and raised her. She stayed with them for about 9 years, Susanna. And she survived and finally was freed from the Indians, and probably about 20,000 people in the state of Rhode Island are descendants of Susan Hutchinson. A lot of people go back to her. So what happened to some of these people? It's interesting. As the colony grew from Portsmouth and Newport and Providence, then Warwick came in, and so on. They began to spread around the bay. Coddington remained very prosperous. Interestingly, now remember, we're talking about 1638. Coddington died in 1708. Okay, he was almost 100 years old. But he had been, in various iterations, the president, the governor, and various other positions. In fact, when he died, he was the governor. John Clark, the Reverend Dr. John Clark, established the First Baptist Church in Newport, and was a prominent figure there. Edward Hutchinson, Sr. and Jr., eventually went back to England. Jr. came back and actually was in command of a colonial Massachusetts regiment in King Philip's War in 1675, and he died in that war. John Coggeshall also was later the president of the colony. And Henry Bull also was a governor. William Balston survived very well with his tavern that he had. William Dyer was the Attorney General of Rhode Island. By the way, when they were going to Narragansett, they were coming up the bay, and they came by this island, and somebody decided it was a good idea. Dyer said he wanted to buy it, so he did, and they gave it to him, actually, and it became Dyer's Island, which it still is, right off Melville. His wife had a rather awkward history, because she was a Quaker eventually, and went to Boston to recruit, and was told to get out. She was banished from Boston. And they said, don't ever come back. She came back, and she was hanged on Boston Common. She was a friend of Anne Hutchinson, too. So anyway, these early settlers are long-term very successful in the Rhode Island colony. The compact, therefore, in conclusion, the compact is a very substantial document, something very important in the history of the United States, Rhode Island, and Portsmouth especially. We are very fortunate to have this here. It's really something special for us. Again, 138 years older than the Declaration of Independence. That's awesome. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to ask, if you have questions, I'm going to ask you to hold them off for a couple minutes, because I want to introduce Ken Carlson, who works at the Rhode Island State Archives. And it's through contact with him and other people there, and with the support of our town clerk, which we are very happy to negotiate this viewing of the compact. Ken works at the State Archives. He's going to tell you just a couple minutes about what they do at the State Archives and what kind of records they have. So let me introduce Ken to talk then. Thank you. Junk out of the way.
My name is Ken Carlson, and for the past 25 years or so I've been the reference archivist here at the State Archives. For those of you not familiar with the State Archives, we are a division within the Office of the Secretary of State. And for nearly 400 years now, it's been the duty of what was then the General Recorder, now the Secretary of State, to maintain, preserve, and make available to the public the official records of state government. So our records begin with document number 1, which is the Portsmouth Compact, and they include all public and private acts of the General Assembly, proceedings of the legislature, official correspondence of the governor, records of birth, marriages, and deaths, military records from the Revolution, the French and Indian Wars, World War I, certifications of election. I mean, the records are voluminous, and they cover nearly 400 years. So the holdings of the State Archives not only tell the history of Rhode Island, but they actually tell the history of Rhode Islanders, because they are so diverse. There are petitions from back to the 1600s from various Rhode Islanders for various reasons. People wanting a divorce, they wanted to adopt a child, they want to start a militia company. So the holdings are quite diverse. And we are located currently on Westminster Street. We used to be in the State House, but for reasons of storage and access, we have been at our location since I've been there, and that's in the early 90s. We're currently in the process of getting a new facility, one that is more conducive to the long-term goals of the archives, because the building we're in is a rented facility, and it's getting smaller by the year. So that's another issue. But so the records that we have, they're all climate controlled, particularly the most important records like the Portsmouth Compact, the original charter from the King of England, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. They're all in climate controlled environments. This particular document was actually bound at some point in the early 19th century with other early records from Portsmouth and Newport, but that binding wasn't conducive to the preservation of the document, so we removed them. They're all in their own individual Mylar sleeves and acid-free folders, so they're well taken care of. And recently, my colleague Tracy Croach, who usually comes here, we scanned all those documents as well for preservation concerns, and we made a copy of that available to you. The archives is open to the public. You can come and view these documents at your convenience. There's actually free parking adjacent to the building, which most people don't want to go to Providence because where am I going to park? But we're more than happy to pull out not only these documents, but any documents that you may think may pertain to your family. As I say, our records go back to the 1600s, so if your family has been here for any length of time, I'm sure there are multitudes of documents that bear not only their signatures, but may pertain to them in some manner. And there's a lot of genealogical research that's done at the archives just because of the nature of the holdings. It's essentially one-stop shopping. You don't have to go to Newport or Portsmouth or Tiverton or Barrington. All the records are congregated in one place. So if your family's been here, you can do quite an amount in a short amount of time. And my job as a reference archivist, I assist on-site researchers that come in and incoming inquiries. So if you even can't make it to the archives, you can always email me or come in, and I'll be more than happy to assist you in any kind of research you may have.
Great. Thank you. Any questions for Ken or me?
I'm sorry if I already talked about this, but when was Providence founded?
1636. Yeah, Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts as well. He was a minister, and he produced the ministers as well, I guess. There's a really good biography of Roger Williams. It's written by a man by the name of John Barry. I just read it about 3 or 4 months ago. It's outstanding in terms of his career. Quite good. Probably did a lot of research with you people.
Well, we have many documents in Roger Williams' handwriting. Roger Williams was very distinct. 17th century handwriting is very unique. It's Old English. It's kind of an art to learn how to read it. But you can pick out Roger Williams in a second because he used a different style and he used a darker ink. So in the proceedings of the legislature, you can always see that's Roger Williams writing this. And most people don't know what he looks like, but I can tell you what his handwriting looks like. They always make him look like Errol Flynn, but for all we know, he could look like Danny DeVito for all we know.
The other question, Fred?
This is the first compact. Do we have what you referred to as the third compact?
Where are they? Do you
The
have
second compact for Portsmouth?
The earliest records are known. They were bound as the records of the island of Rhode Island. And they include Mr. Ballston getting allowed to brew beer and other early meetings of not only Portsmouth but Newport because they predate what we know now as the General Assembly. The General Assembly acting as a unified body really doesn't exist until the 1640s, and even then it wasn't until the Charter of 1663 that they became officially the General Assembly, where it was a united colony. So those early records pertinent to those early settlements were bound in that one volume. It's probably about 100 documents, I'm guessing, and they detail a lot of the early settlements. And once the town records then begin as well, so Portsmouth town clerk would be in custody of any subsequent documents of town meetings and town council and probate and land evidence transfers and those kinds of things.
Yeah, if you really scrounge old bookstores, you might find one called Records of the Town of Portsmouth. I found it was published in 1901, and it does have fragments of some of these early documents and so on. And it also has every earmark of every sheet that was kept on Common Fence Point, which is not very exciting to read. But it's a bound volume, and it's also available on CD, too. You can get that. I guess it's probably going to be available on thumb drive, probably somewhere, too. But anyway, so there are some records like that around. This was over 100 years ago that was republished. It does not include the compact. See, what happened was that the compact was with the Newport records, and when they closed the book and left, they took the compact with them. Okay? So that got filed with Newport records. And that was a problem later on. And so this book begins with 1639 sometime, the records. Any other questions? Nope. Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.